I was sitting at the closing table at Midwest Title Company, about to sign the final papers for my first home purchase, when my parents, Linda and Frank, suddenly burst through the conference room door demanding the closing be stopped, because they needed to be added to the deed. I was mortified as my real estate agent Sarah and the seller's attorney stared in shock. My parents acted like they belonged there with Linda, announcing they deserved half ownership since they raised me and deserved compensation for their investment. The silence in that conference room felt like it lasted forever. Sarah, my real estate agent, looked like she'd just witnessed a car accident. The seller's attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s named Mrs. Patterson, adjusted her glasses and stared at my parents like they'd grown second heads. And Dorothy, the sweet elderly woman selling me her home, sat there clutching her purse with this expression of complete bewilderment. Let me back up and explain how I got here, because this moment represents 28 years of dealing with the most entitled, lazy parents you could imagine. My father, Frank, has never held a steady job in his entire adult life. He bounces between part-time gig work driving for delivery apps when he feels like it doing occasional handyman jobs for neighbors, and spending most of his time complaining about how nobody wants to hire someone his age. The truth is, Frank has been fired from every real job he ever had, because he shows up late, calls in sick constantly, and argues with supervisors about basic job requirements. My mother, Linda, is even worse. She spends her days parked in front of the television binge-watching reality shows and soap operas while complaining about our family's financial struggles. She has this victim mentality, where everything bad that happens is someone else's fault. When I was growing up, she'd blame my teachers for my struggles in school instead of helping with homework. She'd blame store managers when she got fired from retail jobs for showing up late or being rude to customers. She'd blame landlords when we got evicted from apartments for not paying rent on time. Throughout high school, I worked at a grocery store, a pizza place, and did lawn care on weekends just to buy my own clothes and school supplies. While my classmates were playing sports or hanging out after school, I was stocking shelves or delivering pizzas because my parents couldn't provide basic necessities. They'd take my paychecks and promise to save the money for my college fund, but somehow it always disappeared into their beer budget or impulse purchases from home shopping networks. College was entirely on me. I worked full-time at a warehouse while taking classes at the state university. I lived in the cheapest dorm available, ate ramen noodles for most meals, and graduated with a business degree after 6 long years of night classes and weekend shifts. My parents attended exactly 0 school events. They missed my high school graduation because Frank wanted to go fishing with his buddies. They skipped my college graduation because Linda said the ceremony was too long and boring. After graduation, I landed a good job at Midwest Logistics, a freight management company, where I coordinate shipments between manufacturers and retailers. The work is steady, the pay is decent, and my boss Marcus actually appreciates employees who show up on time and do their jobs properly. For the past 3 years, I've been saving every penny I could for this house down payment. I ate packed lunches, drove my beat-up Honda Civic until the wheels nearly fell off, and lived in a tiny studio apartment with furniture from thrift stores. Finding this house was like discovering buried treasure. It's a 3-bedroom ranch in Maple Grove, a quiet neighborhood where families actually take care of their lawns, and kids can ride bikes safely. The house needs some cosmetic updates, but the bones are solid. Dorothy, the original owner, raised her family here and maintained everything perfectly. When I walked through for the first time, I could picture myself grilling on the back deck, maybe getting a dog, finally having space to spread out and live like an adult. I specifically didn't tell my parents about the house hunt because they have this incredible talent for inserting themselves into any success I achieve and claiming credit. When I got promoted to senior coordinator last year, Linda immediately started telling neighbors how she always knew I'd be successful because of her excellent parenting. When I bought my first reliable car, Frank announced to everyone at the family barbecue that I learned my work ethic from him, conveniently forgetting that he'd been unemployed for most of my childhood. The mortgage process took months of paperwork, credit checks, employment verification, and financial documentation. Jessica, my mortgage broker, was amazed at how organized I was with every document. She said most first-time buyers struggle to provide clean financial records. But I've been meticulous about saving and budgeting since I was 16 years old. Getting pre-approved felt like winning the lottery. Now, here I was, 90 minutes into what should have been a routine closing with my parents, acting like they owned the place. Linda had positioned herself in the chair next to mine like she belonged there, while Frank loomed behind us with his arms crossed, giving everyone his intimidating stare that used to work on my high school friends. "I'm sorry," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm not understanding the situation here." "Paul, did you invite your parents to the closing?" "Absolutely not," I said, feeling my face burn with embarrassment. "I have no idea how they even knew about this." "Well, we're here now," Linda announced, smoothing her hair like she was accepting an award. "And we need to discuss some important family business before any papers get signed." Mrs. Patterson looked down at her legal documents, then back at my parents. "Sir, ma'am, this is a private real estate transaction between Mr. Paul Stevens and Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton. Unless you're listed as buyers on the purchase agreement, I'm afraid you can't participate in these proceedings." Frank stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Listen here, lady. This is our son, and we've got legal rights regarding this property purchase." That's when Linda reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that looked like it had been stored in someone's junk drawer for years. She unfolded it dramatically and slapped it down on the polished conference table. "This is a family investment agreement that Paul signed when he turned 18, she declared triumphantly. "It clearly states that we're entitled to 50% ownership of any future real estate he purchases in recognition of our investment in raising him and providing him with the foundation for success." I stared at that piece of paper like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics. I had never seen this document before in my entire life. The handwriting looked suspiciously like Linda's, and the paper had that yellow tinge you get when something sits in direct sunlight for too long. "This is completely fake," I said, reaching for the paper. "I never signed anything like this." Linda snatched it back and held it against her chest. "How dare you call your mother a liar? We've kept this document safe for 10 years, waiting for the right time to exercise our rights." Mrs. Patterson adjusted her glasses again and spoke in that calm, professional voice that attorneys use when they're dealing with crazy people. "I'll need to examine that document and verify its authenticity before we can proceed with this closing." "You can examine it all you want," Frank said smugly. "It's completely legitimate. We had it notarized and everything." Sarah was frantically texting someone on her phone, probably her broker or maybe a psychiatrist. Dorothy looked like she was reconsidering whether she wanted to sell her beautiful home to someone from such a dysfunctional family. And I sat there feeling like my American dream was dissolving into a nightmare, orchestrated by the two people who should have been celebrating my success instead of trying to steal it. "Look," I said, standing up and trying to project some authority. "I don't know what kind of scam you think you're running here, but this closing is happening today. You can take your fake document and leave, or I'm calling security." Ours, security. Linda gasped, pressing her hand to her chest like I'd just threatened to burn down an orphanage. This is how you treat the parents who sacrificed everything to raise you. We're not leaving until our legal interests are protected. Mrs. Patterson was studying the supposed contract with a magnifying glass she'd pulled from her briefcase. After several minutes of examination, she looked up with this expression of professional skepticism. "I'll need to research the validity of this document before we can proceed," she announced. "In the meantime, I'm placing a temporary hold on this closing until all parties can verify their legal standing." That's when I realized my parents hadn't just crashed my closing. They'd potentially derailed the entire purchase with their ridiculous fake contract scheme. Sarah immediately went into damage control mode, suggesting we take a brief recess so everyone could collect themselves and review the documentation privately. But my parents weren't interested in any reasonable solutions. Frank started pacing around the small conference room like he owned the building, while Linda positioned herself between me and the door like some kind of guardian blocking my escape. "We drove 2 hours to get here," Frank announced to the room as if this somehow gave him special privileges. "We deserve respect for all the sacrifices we made raising Paul. You people need to understand that family comes first in America, and our son has legal obligations to honor our investment in his upbringing." The way he said "you people" while gesturing at Sarah and Mrs. Patterson made me cringe with second-hand embarrassment. These were professionals trying to help me achieve homeownership, and my father was treating them like they were personally attacking our family. Linda decided this was the perfect moment to turn on the waterworks. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd somehow produced from thin air and addressed Dorothy directly with this wounded, martyred expression. "Mrs. Hamilton, you seem like a nice woman who understands family values. Can you imagine how heartbroken I am to discover that the son I raised has become so selfish and ungrateful? We're not asking for anything unreasonable. We just want our fair share of the property we helped make possible through 18 years of love and support." Dorothy shifted uncomfortably in her chair and glanced at the clock on the wall. I could see her calculating whether she had enough time to deal with this family drama and still make her evening deadline to vacate the property for her retirement community move. I'd reached my breaking point with their performance. Standing up abruptly, I faced my parents and let 28 years of frustration pour out in front of these strangers who were already questioning whether they wanted to do business with my family. "Sacrifices," I said, my voice rising. "Let me tell you about sacrifices. You missed my high school graduation because Dad wanted to go fishing with his drinking buddies. You've never attended a single parent-teacher conference school play or sports event in my entire life. You borrowed $300 from me when I was 19 for your electric bill and never paid it back. You asked me to co-sign for a truck loan last month that I couldn't afford, and when I said no, you didn't speak to me for 2 weeks." Frank's face turned red, but I wasn't finished. "Mom, you've been unemployed for 4 years. Because you keep getting fired from retail jobs for arguing with customers and showing up late. Dad, you've had 11 different jobs in the past 5 years because you can't follow basic workplace rules. I worked 40 hours a week through college while maintaining a 3.7 GPA, and neither of you even knew when my graduation was scheduled." Linda's fake tears turned into real ones. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down on the guilt trip. "How can you be so cruel?" she sobbed. "We may not be perfect parents, but we kept a roof over your head and food on the table. That has to count for something. We're your family, Paul. Family sticks together and shares success." The title company staff was looking increasingly uncomfortable with our family therapy session playing out in their professional workspace. The receptionist had closed her door, and I could see people walking quickly past our conference room to avoid the drama. Dorothy finally spoke up, her voice thin but determined. "I'm sorry to interrupt this family discussion, but I have a moving truck arriving at my house at 6 o'clock this evening. I need to be completely moved out of the property tonight so I can transition to Sunset Manor Retirement Community tomorrow morning. If this closing can't proceed within the next hour, I'll need to consider other options." "Other options?" Sarah asked, clearly panicking at the thought of losing this deal. "I have a backup buyer who's been waiting for this exact house to come back on the market," Dorothy explained apologetically. "She can close with cash next week if necessary." The mention of a cash buyer sent ice through my veins. I'd been competing against cash offers for months, and this house was perfect for my budget and location needs. Losing it because of my parents' manufactured drama would be devastating. "Mrs. Hamilton, please don't punish me for my parents' behavior," I pleaded. "This closing can proceed normally once we clear up this misunderstanding about their supposed legal claim." "Misunderstanding?" Frank bellowed. "There's no misunderstanding about it. We've got documentation proving our ownership rights, and we're not backing down." Mrs. Patterson had been quietly making phone calls and checking legal databases on her laptop. When she looked up, her expression was serious but not encouraging. "I've consulted with 2 real estate attorneys about this situation," she announced. "The document your parents provided cannot be authenticated without forensic analysis, which could take several days. Additionally, even if it were genuine, the legal enforceability of such an agreement would require separate litigation to determine." "So, what does that mean for today's closing?" Sarah asked anxiously. "It means we're in legal limbo until these ownership questions can be resolved," Mrs. Patterson replied. "I cannot ethically proceed with a property transfer when there are unresolved claims against the title. I felt my dream slipping away because of my parents' selfishness and manipulation. But then, Frank made a critical mistake that revealed the true scope of their scheme. "Fine," he said, pulling out his cell phone with this smug expression. "While we're waiting for the lawyers to sort this out, I should probably mention that I called Paul's mortgage company this morning to inform them about the changes to the loan application." The blood drained from my face. "What changes? What are you talking about?" "Well, since we're going to be co-owners of the property, I figured the mortgage company should know about adding our names to the loan," Frank explained casually, like he was discussing the weather. "I called them up, told them I was you, and explained that you wanted to add 2 additional borrowers to the mortgage application." Sarah's phone immediately started ringing. She glanced at the caller ID and her face went pale. "It's Jessica from the mortgage company," she said, looking at me with panic in her eyes. The conference room fell completely silent except for Sarah's ringtone. Everyone was staring at Frank, who was still holding his phone with this satisfied grin, like he'd just solved world hunger. "You impersonated me to my mortgage company," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How did you even know who to call?" Frank shrugged, like identity theft was no big deal. "I got the information from those papers on your kitchen table when we stopped by your apartment last week. You really should lock up important documents better." That's when I realized my parents had used the emergency key I'd given them 6 months ago when I was traveling for work. They'd gone through my private financial documents, obtained my mortgage company information, and somehow convinced Jessica that they were me requesting changes to my loan application. Sarah answered her phone with trembling hands and immediately put it on speaker. "Sarah, thank goodness you answered." Jessica's voice came through clearly. "I'm getting conflicting information about the Stevens loan closing today. Someone called this morning claiming to be Paul requesting to add 2 co-borrowers to the mortgage, but it contradicted everything we discussed throughout the application process. I've placed a temporary funding hold until I can verify the borrower's actual intentions. The room erupted into chaos. Mrs. Patterson started taking notes furiously. Dorothy looked like she wanted to escape through the window. Sarah was stammering explanations to Jessica about the family situation. And Frank was standing there looking proud of himself for creating this disaster. Mr. Stevens. Mrs. Patterson said, addressing me directly, "Are you telling me that your father contacted your mortgage company using your identity, without your knowledge or permission?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I replied, feeling sick to my stomach. I never authorized any changes to my mortgage application. I've been planning this as a single borrower for the entire process. Frank finally seemed to realize that he'd just admitted to multiple crimes in front of witnesses, including an attorney and a mortgage professional who were probably required to report identity theft. Now, hold on. He backpedaled. I was just trying to help coordinate the family aspects of this purchase. Paul obviously forgot to handle those details himself. Paul forgot nothing. Jessica's voice came through the speaker with professional authority. He's been extremely thorough and consistent throughout this entire process. Someone impersonating him this morning has created a serious security breach that requires immediate investigation. Linda was still clutching her fake family investment contract, but her earlier confidence had evaporated as the legal implications of Frank's identity theft admission sank in. Maybe we should discuss this privately as a family, she suggested, weakly, finally understanding that their scheme was backfiring spectacularly. But it was too late for private discussions. Frank had just confessed to identity theft in front of multiple witnesses, and the mortgage fraud implications were serious enough to derail not just my closing, but potentially my entire loan approval. Jessica was still on speakerphone, and her voice carried the professional concern of someone who'd just discovered a potential fraud case. She asked me to verify several personal details that only I would know, including my employee identification number, my previous address, and the exact amount of my down payment. After I provided all the correct information, she confirmed that the morning caller had not possessed these details and had become evasive when asked for verification. "Paul, I need you to understand how serious this situation is," Jessica explained. "Mortgage fraud involving identity theft is a federal crime. I'm required to file a report with our security department, and they'll likely involve law enforcement. In the meantime, I have to maintain the funding hold until we can verify that your loan application hasn't been compromised." Frank was beginning to look less confident about his brilliant plan. He kept glancing toward the door like he was calculating whether he could escape before the consequences caught up with him. Linda had gone completely silent, clutching her purse and staring at the fake contract like it might magically become real. "How did you obtain my mortgage company information?" I demanded, staring directly at Frank. "That paperwork was secured in my apartment. We had your emergency key," Linda admitted quietly, apparently deciding that honesty might be their best strategy now. "We stopped by last weekend when you weren't home to check on things. You know, make sure you were keeping the place clean and taking care of yourself properly. You went through my personal documents without permission," I said, feeling the violation like a physical punch. "What else did you look at while you were snooping through my private information?" Frank straightened up, trying to regain some authority. "We're your parents. We have a right to know what's going on in your life, especially when you're making major financial decisions without consulting the family. Mrs. Patterson had been taking detailed notes throughout this conversation, and she looked up with the expression lawyers get when they're calculating billable hours. Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, I need to inform you that unauthorized access to someone's private financial documents combined with impersonating them to financial institutions constitutes several potential criminal charges. You're essentially confessing to identity theft and fraud in front of multiple witnesses. Criminal charges. Linda gasped, her fake contract fluttering to the floor. We're his parents. We were just trying to protect our family interests. Sarah was coordinating damage control with Jessica, trying to determine whether the closing could proceed if I filed an official statement confirming my identity and disavowing any unauthorized contact with the mortgage company. Meanwhile, Dorothy was checking her watch and looking increasingly agitated about her evening deadline. That's when Dorothy surprised everyone by speaking up with information that changed everything. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the room but looking specifically at Frank. "I believe I need to share something relevant to this discussion. I've been receiving unusual phone calls for the past week from someone claiming to be Paul's father." All eyes turned to Dorothy as she opened her small leather purse and pulled out a notebook where she'd apparently been documenting these calls. The first call came last Tuesday evening. She continued reading from her notes. A man identifying himself as Frank Stevens asked detailed questions about the property value neighborhood appreciation rates and whether I'd consider a rent-to-own arrangement instead of a traditional sale. Frank's face had gone from red to pale in about 10 seconds. Linda was staring at him with this expression of dawning horror, like she was realizing her husband had been planning this scheme for much longer than she'd known. He called again on Thursday. Dorothy continued, asking about the property taxes, utility costs, and whether there were any liens or encumbrances on the title. When I told him these questions should be directed through the real estate agents, he claimed he was conducting due diligence on behalf of his son. Sarah was frantically checking her phone records. "Dorothy, did you mention these calls to me during any of our conversations?" "I thought about it," Dorothy admitted, but the caller seemed to have legitimate knowledge about Paul and the purchase, so I assumed it was normal family involvement. However, when he called yesterday, asking whether the closing could be postponed and if I'd accept a family partnership arrangement instead of a single buyer, I began to suspect something wasn't right. Frank had been caught in yet another lie. Not only had he impersonated me to the mortgage company, but he'd been secretly investigating the property and attempting to manipulate the seller for over a week. And Frank? Linda hissed, finally understanding the full scope of her husband's deception. "You told me this investment contract idea just came to you this morning when we saw Paul's closing paperwork on his counter. I was protecting our family's interests." Frank protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Paul's been secretive about this whole house purchase, and I knew if we didn't act fast, we'd be left out completely." Mrs. Patterson was scribbling notes furiously, and I could see her building a legal case in real time. "Mr. Stevens, let me understand the timeline here," she said, addressing Frank with prosecutorial precision. "You accessed your son's private documents without authorization, contacted the property seller multiple times under false pretenses, impersonated your son to his mortgage company, and produced fraudulent documentation claiming ownership rights to property you've never had any legal claim to. Is that an accurate summary?" "When you put it like that, it sounds bad," Frank mumbled. "It sounds bad, because it is bad," I said, my anger finally overriding my embarrassment. "You've been planning this con job for weeks while pretending to support my independence." Linda was crying again, but these seemed like genuine tears of regret rather than her earlier manipulation tactics. "We just wanted to be included," she sobbed. "We're your parents, and we've never owned property ourselves. When we found out you were buying a house, it felt like you were moving on without us, and we panicked. So you decided to steal my house instead of congratulating me?" I asked incredulously. Dorothy had been listening to this family drama with increasing sympathy, but she also had practical concerns about her own timeline. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said gently, "but I need to make a decision about this evening's move. My retirement community is expecting me tomorrow morning, and the moving company charges double rates if we have to reschedule." Sarah looked up from her phone coordination with Jessica. "Dorothy Paul's mortgage company is willing to proceed with the original loan terms if he files a formal identity theft report and provides additional documentation confirming he never authorized any changes to the application. That process could take another hour. I'm willing to stay late to complete this closing," Mrs. Patterson added, "but only if we can resolve the ownership dispute definitively." That's when Dorothy pulled out her cell phone and showed us her call history. Frank's number appeared 6 different times over the past week, with call durations ranging from 12 minutes to over half an hour. "I have detailed records of every conversation," Dorothy announced, "including his specific questions about modifying the sale terms and his attempts to delay or alter the closing arrangements. This appears to be evidence of a coordinated effort to defraud both the buyer and the seller." Frank was trapped. He'd not only admitted to identity theft and document fraud, but Dorothy had documented evidence of his week-long scheme to manipulate the property transaction. Linda's fake investment contract was meaningless in the face of multiple criminal charges. But just as I thought we were gaining control of the situation, Linda revealed that their desperation ran even deeper than I'd imagined. I'd heard enough. While Frank was stammering through weak justifications and Linda was weeping into tissues, I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. If my parents wanted to play games with identity theft and fraud, they were about to learn that actions have consequences. I need to report identity theft and fraud related to a real estate transaction in progress. I told the dispatcher, providing the title company address and a brief summary of the situation. The dispatcher informed me that an officer would be dispatched within 20 minutes to take statements and assess potential criminal charges. While I was on the phone, I activated my phone's video recording function and began documenting everything. Frank's admission about impersonating me to the mortgage company, Linda's fake investment contract, Dorothy's evidence of Frank's unauthorized contact with the seller and my parents' unauthorized access to my apartment and private documents. "Paul, you don't need to involve the police," Linda pleaded, suddenly realizing that their scheme had escalated beyond family drama into actual criminal activity. "We can work this out privately. We're family." "Family doesn't commit identity theft," I replied, continuing to record their statements. "Family doesn't break into apartments and steal personal information. Family doesn't sabotage their children's dreams for their own selfish gain." Sarah was coordinating with Jessica to implement the security protocols necessary to restore my mortgage funding. This involved me providing additional identification documents, answering detailed security questions about my employment and financial history, and signing affidavits confirming that I had not authorized any changes to my loan application. "Jessica wants to know if you'll be pressing criminal charges against the person who impersonated you," Sarah asked. "It affects how they handle their internal fraud investigation." "Absolutely," I said, looking directly at Frank. "I want full prosecution for identity theft mortgage fraud and whatever other charges apply to this situation." Frank finally seemed to understand that his actions had serious legal consequences. He'd gone from confident schemer to panicked defendant in the span of an hour. "Look, son, maybe I made some mistakes here," he said, trying to adopt a conciliatory tone. "But there's no need to destroy your family over a misunderstanding. We can forget about the house situation and go back to normal. Normal." I laughed bitterly. Normal was you never supporting anything positive in my life. Normal was you borrowing money and never paying it back. Normal was you missing every important milestone while taking credit for my achievements. This isn't normal, Frank. This is criminal. Mrs. Patterson had been quietly reviewing legal precedents on her laptop while we waited for the police. When she looked up, her expression was grimly professional. "Mr. Stevens, I should inform you that mortgage fraud involving identity theft typically carries federal penalties including fines up to $100,000 and up to 5 years in prison. The unauthorized access to financial documents adds additional state charges that could result in separate prosecution." Linda's fake tears turned into genuine panic. 5 years in prison for trying to help our family. That's completely unreasonable. What's unreasonable is committing multiple felonies to steal your son's house. Mrs. Patterson replied matter-of-factly. Dorothy was checking her phone messages and looking increasingly concerned about her evening deadline. Despite her sympathy for my situation, she had legitimate logistical constraints that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. "Paul," she said kindly, "I want you to have this house. You've been honest and professional throughout this entire process, and I can see how hard you've worked to make this purchase happen. But I need to know if we can complete this closing tonight or if I should contact my backup buyer. We're going to complete it tonight," I said firmly. My parents' criminal behavior doesn't change the fact that I'm a qualified buyer with legitimate financing. Officer Martinez arrived at the title company within 15 minutes of my call. He was a veteran officer in his 40s who looked like he'd dealt with family fraud cases before. After introducing himself and checking everyone's identification, he began taking detailed statements about the events leading up to the disrupted closing. I provided him with copies of my mortgage documents, evidence of my parents' unauthorized access to my apartment, and Dorothy's phone records showing Frank's week-long manipulation scheme. Sarah contributed documentation from the mortgage company confirming the unauthorized identity theft contact. When Officer Martinez interviewed Frank, the full scope of their desperation became clear. "Mr. Stevens, I need to verify some information from our background database," the officer said, running Frank's driver's license through his patrol car computer. After several minutes, he returned to the conference room with information that changed everything. "Sir, I'm seeing an outstanding warrant for your arrest related to passing bad checks in Jefferson County." The warrant was issued 3 weeks ago for checks totaling $875. Frank's face went completely white. Linda gasped and stared at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Additionally, Officer Martinez continued, "Our database shows an ongoing investigation into benefits fraud involving a Linda Stevens at your address. The Department of Social Services has flagged potential unreported income while claiming disability benefits. Now, it was Linda's turn to look terrified. Instead of being in position to threaten my career or steal my house, my parents were facing serious legal consequences for their own criminal behavior. Officer, there must be some mistake," Linda stammered. "I've been completely honest about my disability status." "Ma'am, I'm not conducting that investigation, but I can tell you that working under-the-table jobs while collecting disability benefits constitutes fraud. The investigators have been building a case for several months. Frank was looking around the room like a trapped animal, calculating whether he could escape before being arrested on the outstanding warrant. "Mr. Stevens, I need you to remain seated while I verify these warrants," Officer Martinez said firmly. Any attempt to leave could result in additional charges for evading arrest. Sarah was frantically texting Jessica with updates about the police involvement and criminal charges. Dorothy was calculating whether she could still make her moving deadline if we resolved the legal issues quickly. Mrs. Patterson was documenting everything for potential litigation, and suddenly my parents were no longer in position to threaten me or steal my property. They were facing arrest for their own crimes, while I had a police officer documenting their confession to identity theft and fraud. The tables had completely turned, but my parents still had one more desperate card to play. With Officer Martinez verifying Frank's outstanding warrant and Linda's benefits fraud investigation, my parents realized their scheme was collapsing into a legal nightmare. But instead of backing down gracefully, they decided to deploy their most destructive weapon, threatening my professional reputation. "Fine," Linda said, her voice taking on this cold, calculating tone I'd never heard before. "If you want to destroy your family with these criminal charges, we'll have to protect ourselves." "Frank, show him the bank statements." Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out several folded pieces of paper that I immediately recognized as photographs of my personal banking documents. My stomach dropped as I realized they'd taken pictures of everything in my apartment, not just my mortgage information. "Oh, your son has been living far beyond his means for a 28-year-old logistics coordinator," Linda announced to the room, unfolding the photographed bank statements like she was presenting evidence at a trial. "These deposits look extremely suspicious. No honest person his age could save this much money for a house down payment without some kind of illegal activity." "What are you talking about?" I asked, reaching for the papers. "Every dollar I've saved is completely legitimate." "Really?" Frank said, pointing to specific deposit amounts on the statements. $3,000 deposited in cash every month for 2 years. That's drug money or stolen goods or some kind of tax evasion scheme. We're going to call your employer and the FBI to report your suspicious wealth." Officer Martinez looked up from his computer with interest, but not the kind my parents were hoping for. "Sir, are you threatening to file false reports about your son's finances?" "They're not false," Linda insisted. "Look at these numbers. A logistics worker can't legitimately save $60,000 in 3 years. He's obviously involved in some kind of criminal enterprise, and we have the evidence to prove it." This threat terrified me because Midwest Logistics takes financial integrity seriously. The company handles millions of dollars in freight transactions, and employees undergo regular background checks and financial auditing. Even false accusations of financial crimes could jeopardize my career while the company investigated. "Paul," Sarah said quietly, "can you explain these large cash deposits? It would help to clarify the situation before your parents contact your employer." "Of course I can explain them," I said, pulling out my phone to access my detailed financial records. "I've been working overtime shifts at the warehouse doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses and selling refurbished electronics online. Every dollar has been reported on my tax returns and documented with receipts." But Frank wasn't finished with his threats. "We're also going to contact the IRS about potential tax evasion, the State Labor Department about unreported income, and every financial institution he's dealt with to report suspicious activity. If he wants to destroy his family, we'll make sure his career goes down with us." Linda was nodding along with this plan like they were discussing weekend dinner arrangements. Maybe he'll reconsider this police report nonsense when he realizes how much his accusations will cost him professionally. Dorothy looked absolutely horrified that her simple house sale had devolved into a family war involving threats, blackmail, and mutual destruction. Mrs. Patterson was scribbling notes about the criminal threats being made in front of witnesses, including a police officer. Mr. and Mrs. Stevens. Officer Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd reached the end of his patience. You're now threatening to file false police reports and fraudulent complaints against your son in retaliation for his legitimate criminal complaint against you. That's called witness intimidation, and it's a separate felony. They're not false reports, Frank insisted. We have documentation of suspicious activity. Sir, threatening to file complaints you know to be false or filing reports in bad faith for purposes of retaliation is a crime regardless of what documentation you possess. Officer Martinez ran background checks on both my parents while they continued making threats about destroying my reputation. When he returned from his patrol car, his expression was grim, but not for the reasons they expected. Mr. Stevens, you have an active warrant for $875 in bad checks. I'm placing you under arrest. He began reading Frank the Miranda rights while pulling out handcuffs. This is ridiculous, Frank protested as Officer Martinez cuffed his hands behind his back. I'm the victim here. My son is stealing property that rightfully belongs to his family. Ma'am. Officer Martinez said, addressing Linda. I strongly advise you to contact an attorney before making any reports to government agencies. The benefits fraud investigation against you is active, and filing false reports could result in additional charges. Linda was staring at Frank in handcuffs like she couldn't process what was happening. Her husband was being arrested. She was under investigation for fraud, and their attempt to steal my house had backfired into a criminal nightmare. Officer Martinez, what happens to the fake investment contract? I asked, pointing to the crumpled paper Linda had dropped on the floor. That's evidence of attempted fraud, he replied. I'll be collecting it along with the photographed bank statements and any other documents related to this case. Sarah was coordinating frantically with Jessica to salvage the closing. With Frank under arrest and Linda facing her own legal troubles, the mortgage company was willing to proceed once I provided additional documentation proving the legitimacy of my income sources. Paul, I have your tax returns for the past 3 years, your freelance client contracts and receipts for your electronics sales business, Jessica confirmed over speakerphone. Everything checks out as legitimate income that's been properly reported and documented. Your parents' accusations have no merit. Mrs. Patterson was preparing the legal paperwork to proceed with the closing, but she wanted to address the attempted fraud charges before finalizing the property transfer. Mr. Stevens, do you want to press charges for the attempted property fraud, identity theft, and document forgery in addition to the existing criminal matters? Yes, I said without hesitation. I want full prosecution for everything they've done. But as Officer Martinez was escorting Frank toward the door, Linda made one final desperate move that revealed just how far she'd already gone to destroy my reputation. I already called your boss this afternoon, she announced with this vindictive smile. I left a detailed message with his secretary about your suspicious income and criminal associations. So, even if you don't press charges against us, your career is already ruined. The conference room went silent, except for the sound of Frank's handcuffs jingling as Officer Martinez stopped walking. Ma'am, did you just admit to filing a false report against your son's employer? The officer asked. It's not false, Linda said defiantly. I have evidence of financial irregularities. Evidence that was obtained through breaking and entering into his apartment and photographing private documents without permission, Officer Martinez pointed out. That's burglary and theft. I pulled out my phone immediately and called Marcus my supervisor at Midwest Logistics. His direct number went to voicemail, but his secretary, Brenda, answered. Brenda, this is Paul Stevens. Did someone call the office today making accusations about me? Oh, Paul, yes. We received a very strange call from someone claiming to be your mother. She made some concerning allegations about your financial activities. Mr. Marcus wants to speak with you first thing tomorrow morning. My heart sank as I realized Linda had potentially destroyed my career with her vindictive lies, but Officer Martinez was already documenting her admission for additional criminal charges. Ma'am, filing false reports with someone's employer as retaliation for criminal charges constitutes harassment, witness intimidation, and potentially libel. I am adding those charges to your case. Linda finally seemed to understand that every move they'd made had only made their legal situation worse, while failing to gain them any ownership in my property. But the damage to my professional reputation might already be done. With Frank in handcuffs and Linda panicking about her own mounting legal troubles, I realized this was my moment to take complete control of the situation. My parents had revealed the full extent of their desperation and criminal behavior, and Officer Martinez had documented everything they'd confessed to. Officer Martinez, I said, pulling out my comprehensive financial documentation. I want to provide complete evidence of my legitimate income sources to counter their false accusations about suspicious wealth. I'd brought copies of my tax returns, bank statements, employment records, and documentation for all my side income sources, specifically for the mortgage closing. Now, these documents would serve double duty as evidence against my parents' fraudulent claims. These are my tax returns for the past 3 years, showing income from Midwest Logistics overtime warehouse shifts, freelance bookkeeping for 6 small businesses, and profits from my electronics refurbishing business. I explained, laying everything out on the conference table. Every dollar has been properly reported and documented. Officer Martinez examined the paperwork, while I called my supervisor Marcus on speakerphone. Marcus answered immediately, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Paul, I'm glad you called. We received some very disturbing allegations about your financial activities from someone claiming to be your mother. She suggested you might be involved in money laundering or embezzlement. Marcus, I'm currently at a real estate closing with a police officer present because my parents have been arrested for identity theft fraud and making false reports. I explained. The person who called your office was retaliating against me for pressing criminal charges against them for attempting to steal my house. She mentioned something about suspicious cash deposits and criminal associations. Marcus continued. The allegations were serious enough that HR wants to investigate. I have complete documentation for every income source. I said, sharing my screen with the financial records spread across the conference table. Officer Martinez is here and can verify that my parents' accusations are part of their criminal fraud scheme. Officer Martinez took the phone and identified himself as the arresting officer. Sir, this is Officer Martinez with the Metro Police. The allegations against your employee appear to be false reports filed in retaliation for legitimate criminal charges. We have documented evidence of the suspect's fraudulent activities and their admitted plan to file false accusations against Mr. Stevens. Marcus was quiet for several moments processing this information. Paul, Can you be in my office tomorrow morning with all this documentation? We need to clear this up officially for HR purposes. But it sounds like you're the victim here rather than the perpetrator. Absolutely. I replied, feeling relief that my employer was willing to hear my side before making any judgments. I'll bring everything, including the police report documenting my parents' criminal activities. While I was handling damage control with my employer, Sarah had been coordinating with Jessica to finalize the mortgage approval. With my income legitimacy confirmed and the criminal complaints documented, the mortgage company was ready to proceed with the original loan terms. Dorothy had been checking her watch anxiously, but she'd also been impressed by how I'd handled the crisis with documentation and professionalism, instead of emotional manipulation like my parents. "Paul," she said, "I want you to have this house. You've shown integrity throughout this terrible situation, and I can see you'll take good care of the property." Mrs. Patterson was preparing the final closing documents, but she wanted to ensure my parents couldn't interfere with the property transfer in the future. "I'm recommending that we include specific language in the deed transfer explicitly stating that Frank and Linda Stevens have no claim interest or ownership rights to this property," she explained. "Additionally, I want Linda to sign a notarized document relinquishing any future claims before we finalize the closing." Linda was still in the conference room looking defeated and confused about her legal situation. When Mrs. Patterson approached her with the relinquishment document, she hesitated. "If I sign this, does it help with the criminal charges against me?" Linda asked hopefully. "Ma'am, this document only addresses property claims," Officer Martinez explained. "The criminal charges for benefits, fraud, filing false reports, and participating in identity theft are separate matters that require separate legal resolution. However," Mrs. Patterson added, "cooperating with the property transfer and formally relinquishing fraudulent claims might be viewed favorably by prosecutors when they're considering plea agreements." Linda signed the document with a notary public who'd been called to the title company. As she signed away any claim to my house, I felt a profound sense of justice and relief. But just as we were preparing to finalize the closing, my phone rang with a call that would reveal one more shocking layer to my parents' desperation. "Paul, this is Jerry from Sunset Gardens Apartments," the voice said. I recognized Jerry as my parents' landlord, though I couldn't imagine why he'd be calling me. "Jerry, why are you calling me?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker at Officer Martinez's request. "Well, your parents listed you as their emergency contact, and I've been trying to reach them for 2 weeks about their eviction notice. They're 3 months behind on rent, and I need to know if you're planning to help them with the back payments or if I should proceed with formal eviction." The conference room went completely silent. Linda's face turned bright red as everyone realized the true reason behind their desperate attempt to steal my house. "Jerry, how much do they owe in back rent?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. $4,200 plus late fees and court costs. If they don't pay by Friday, the sheriff will remove them from the property. Linda started crying again, but these were tears of genuine despair rather than manipulative theater. Frank, even in handcuffs, looked humiliated at having his financial failure exposed to the entire room. "Jerry, I'm not responsible for my parents' rent," I said firmly. "They didn't tell me they were facing eviction, and I'm not in position to cover their debts. I understand, son. I just wanted to check before I proceed with the legal process. Your parents seemed to think you'd be willing to help once you found out about their situation." After I hung up, Officer Martinez looked at Linda with this expression of professional understanding mixed with disappointment. "Ma'am, were you and your husband planning to move in with your son without telling him? Is that why you needed your names on his deed Linda nodded miserably, finally admitting the truth. We knew Paul would never agree to let us live with him, but we thought if we were legal co-owners of his house, we could move in whether he wanted us there or not. The full scope of their scheme was finally revealed. They weren't just trying to steal my property for financial gain. They were facing homelessness and saw my house as their solution, planning to force me to support them by making themselves legal co-owners through fraud. So, this entire scheme was to avoid homelessness by stealing your son's house and forcing him to provide you with free housing. Officer Martinez summarized. "We're his parents," Linda said weakly. "Family is supposed to help family. Family is supposed to be honest with family," I replied. "If you'd told me you were facing eviction, we could have discussed options. Instead, you chose to commit multiple felonies to steal my house and force me into a situation I never agreed to." Mrs. Patterson was adding additional protective language to the deed transfer, ensuring my parents could never claim residency rights or attempt to establish tenancy at my new property. The closing was finally ready to proceed with all criminal matters documented, and my parents' fraudulent claims permanently relinquished. But their homelessness added a complicated emotional dimension to the justice I was seeking. With all the legal documentation in order, and my parents' fraudulent claims officially relinquished, we were finally ready to complete the closing that should have taken 2 hours, but had stretched into an entire evening of family drama and criminal confessions. I signed the final papers while Officer Martinez waited to transport Frank to the county jail for processing on his outstanding warrant. Linda sat quietly in the corner, clutching her purse and staring at the floor, finally understanding that her schemes had accomplished nothing except creating serious legal problems for both herself and her husband. Dorothy handed me the keys to my first home, with this warm smile that made all the chaos worthwhile. "Paul, I hope you'll be very happy in this house. You've shown remarkable character dealing with this difficult situation, and I know you'll take wonderful care of the property. Thank you, Mrs. Hamilton," I said, feeling the weight and significance of those keys in my hand. "I promise to honor what you built there." Sarah was beaming with relief that we'd salvaged the deal despite the unprecedented drama. Mrs. Patterson was organizing all the legal documents for potential prosecution evidence, while ensuring the property transfer was completely bulletproof against future challenges. As Officer Martinez prepared to leave with Frank, I made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Officer, before you transport my father, I'd like to speak with both my parents privately for 5 minutes." Linda looked up hopefully, probably thinking I was about to offer them money for their rent or invite them to live with me. Frank straightened up as much as possible in handcuffs, putting on his best, father knows best expression. "I want you both to understand something clearly." I began, keeping my voice calm and measured. "I'm not going to pay your back rent. I'm not going to let you move in with me. I'm not going to bail you out of jail or hire attorneys for your legal problems. And I'm not going to feel guilty about any of those decisions." Linda started to interrupt with another guilt trip, but I held up my hand. "For 28 years, you've taught me that family is only important when it benefits you. You missed every milestone that mattered to me, but you showed up tonight to steal my success. You borrowed money and never paid it back, but you expected me to fund your schemes. You failed to plan for your own futures, but you thought you could force me to solve your problems." Frank was shaking his head like I was being unreasonable. But I continued. "However, I'm also not going to pursue the maximum criminal penalties against you. I'll cooperate with the investigations that are already underway, but I won't push for extended prison sentences or excessive fines. You're facing consequences for your own choices not because I'm vindictive. What does that mean for us? Linda asked quietly. It means you need to find your own solutions to your own problems like adults, I replied. Contact social services about emergency housing assistance. Look into bankruptcy protection for your debts. Get real jobs and take responsibility for your lives. But do it without involving me or expecting me to rescue you from situations you created. Officer Martinez was nodding approvingly at this boundary-setting conversation. Sarah and Mrs. Patterson were also listening with interest, probably recognizing that family dysfunction was being addressed in a healthy way, despite the criminal circumstances. I'm changing my phone number and my emergency contacts at work, I continued. I'm installing security systems at my new house, and I'm not giving anyone access to my personal information or financial documents ever again. This situation has taught me that I need to protect myself from people who would exploit my trust, even if they're family. Frank finally spoke up, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance. Paul, we know we made mistakes here, but we're still your parents. That has to count for something. It counts for something. I agreed. It counts for me not pressing charges for breaking into my apartment. It counts for me not pursuing civil lawsuits for the financial damage you caused. And it counts for me hoping you'll eventually get your lives together and become people I'd actually want to have relationships with. But it doesn't count for me enabling your dysfunction or accepting abuse because we share DNA, I added firmly. Being family doesn't give you license to steal from me, lie about me, or sabotage my dreams. Linda was crying again, but these seemed like genuine tears of understanding rather than manipulative theater. So what happens now? She asked. Now you face the legal consequences of your actions just like any other criminals would. Officer Martinez answered. Mr. Stevens has shown remarkable restraint in not pursuing maximum penalties, but the justice system still has to address identity theft fraud and false reporting. As Frank was escorted to the police car, he turned back and said something that actually surprised me with its sincerity. I'm proud of you for buying this house, son. I'm sorry we tried to ruin it for you. It wasn't much of an apology, and it didn't undo the damage they'd caused, but it was perhaps the first honest thing he'd said all day. 6 months later, I was hosting a housewarming party for my coworkers and neighbors. Marcus had attended my meeting with HR the next morning, where I'd provided complete documentation of my income sources and the police report about my parents' criminal activities. The company had actually commended me for handling the situation professionally and maintaining detailed financial records. My new house had been transformed into everything I'd dreamed of. I'd painted the rooms, updated the kitchen fixtures, and planted a vegetable garden in the backyard. My neighbor Jim, a retired teacher, had helped me install a security system and had become a good friend who appreciated my work ethic and integrity. Frank had served 60 days in county jail for the bad check charges and received probation for the identity theft. Linda had entered a plea agreement for benefits fraud, requiring her to repay $12,000 in wrongfully collected benefits and complete 200 hours of community service. Both of them had moved into low-income housing assistance programs and were supposedly working part-time jobs, though I only heard updates through my aunt, who still maintained contact. During the housewarming party, Marcus pulled me aside to share some news. Paul, I've been watching how you handled that family crisis, and I'm impressed with your judgment and documentation skills. We are expanding our fraud prevention department, and I'd like you to consider a promotion to senior investigator. The position involves examining financial irregularities and working with law enforcement on cases involving logistics fraud. That sounds perfect. I said, realizing that my parents' criminal behavior had actually led to a career opportunity in preventing exactly the kind of fraud they'd attempted. As the party was winding down, my girlfriend Amanda, who I'd met at a community college business course, helped me clean up while we planned our future together. She'd heard the complete story of my house-closing disaster, and her reaction had been to admire my boundary-setting skills rather than pressure me to reconcile with my parents. "Do you ever regret pressing charges against them?" she asked as we packed up leftover food. "No," I said honestly. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret protecting myself and holding them accountable. Some people learn from consequences and some people don't. Either way, I'm not responsible for fixing their problems or enabling their dysfunction." The deeper lesson I'd learned was that family dysfunction doesn't define your potential, and sometimes the people who should support your dreams become the biggest obstacles to achieving them. Success requires protecting yourself from those who would exploit your achievements while building relationships with people who genuinely celebrate your growth. Real family isn't determined by blood relationships or guilt obligations. Real family consists of people who support your goals, respect your boundaries, and celebrate your successes without trying to steal credit or demand unearned benefits. Sometimes you have to create that family from friends, colleagues, neighbors, and romantic partners who share your values and integrity. I'd also learned the importance of documentation, legal protection, and professional boundaries. Keeping detailed financial records had saved my career and enabled my home purchase. Setting clear boundaries had protected my mental health and prevented ongoing manipulation. And working with professionals like Sarah Mrs. Patterson and Officer Martinez had shown me how systems exist to protect honest people from those who would exploit them. My parents had taught me one final lesson, though, probably not the one they intended. They'd shown me that entitlement, laziness, and manipulation ultimately lead to failure and legal consequences. But hard work, honesty, and personal responsibility lead to genuine success and self-respect. As I sat on my front porch that evening, making my mortgage payment online and planning weekend projects for my home, I reflected on how different my life had become. Instead of dreading family interactions full of guilt trips and financial demands, I was surrounded by people who appreciated my character and celebrated my achievements. I'd received a letter from my parents the previous week, asking for money to help with their housing situation, but I'd shredded it without reading past the first paragraph. Their problems were still their responsibility, and my success was still my accomplishment. The boundaries I'd established weren't cruel. They were necessary for my own growth and happiness. The American dream isn't just about homeownership or financial success. It's about the freedom to build a life based on your own efforts and values, surrounded by people who respect your journey and support your goals. Sometimes, achieving that dream requires protecting yourself from those who would steal it, even if they happen to share your last name. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who tried to take advantage of your success? How did you handle relatives who felt entitled to benefit from your hard work without contributing anything themselves? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let me know if you think I made the right choice in pressing charges against my parents. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to help others who might be dealing with similar family dysfunction find these insights. Subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming family obstacles and building successful, independent lives. And share this with anyone who needs encouragement to set healthy boundaries with toxic relatives. Thanks for listening to my story. and remember that you have the right to protect your dreams from people who would exploit them regardless of their relationship to you. May your own journey toward independence and success be filled with people who genuinely support your growth and celebrate your achievements.